morning everyone, Jason here. Today we are going to create a paintover of a screenshot from a grey box level. Wow, that's quite a mouthful. So let's just break it down. So what do I mean by paintover? As the name suggests, it's basically painting over an existing image. And in this case, it is a screenshot. A grey box level is simply a level that is made up of grey cubes and spheres, basically programmer art. They are used as placeholders, sort of the game designer's way of constructing the level in its very primitive and like skeletal form, which helps them to sort of test out whether their design works before art is being implemented. So I think this is an appropriate time to sort of share with you guys what I did in the past, sort of my a brief history of my career in the game industry. Previously, I was working on this indie game called Mechazoo. You guys can actually find that on the Steam marketplace if you're interested. It's basically a 2.5D platforming game where you control 5 different animal characters and you can switch between them to use their unique abilities to complete the level. Anyways, my main role in that project is that of an art director. So my main job scope was to actually define the visual and aesthetic qualities of the game. During the development, I've created characters, props, interactables, and environment. As a platforming game, I would say about close to 70 to 80% of the screen is actually filled by the environment, and because of that, making sure that the environment is visually appealing and attractive to the player is actually very important, almost to a point where it might even be more important than the characters. So during the development process, I find that using paintovers over existing screenshots of the grey box level is especially helpful because they allow me to inform the rest of the artists of what kind of assets that needs to be created for that particular level, where to populate these assets. And I would say that even though Mechazoo is a 3D game, this kind of process does work for a 2D game as well. And therefore in this video we will kind of explore some techniques that I personally use when creating these paintovers. Again, they are kind of similar to creating environment concept art, only in this case you have to sort of factor in gameplay and readability, and you're kind of constrained by the sort of design, the game design that is given to you by the game designer. So without further ado, let's get on with it. So first up, we load up the screenshot in Photoshop, and it will act as a base plate for us to paint. And the first thing I would usually do is to block in the colors that I think would fit into the kind of environment and mood that I'm going for. For this particular example, I'm trying to create sort of like a cyberpunk theme level that is kind of inspired by 80s synthwave music. So kind of like I'm trying to have a cool space vibe to this level. And going back to Mechazoo, we were actually really inspired by electro swing music, which is why when you look at concept art and screenshots of that game, you can kind of see our influences. So in general, I like to build from the back to the front, so from the background to the foreground. However, in this particular case, I'm just quickly blocking out the gameplay elements, right? The platforms that the player will actually interact with, so that I don't forget about them when I'm designing these levels. Yep. So as I mentioned, I usually start from the back to the front. Right now I'm just blocking in the sky. For the sky, I wanted kind of like a Martian, brownish, purplish, evening kind of scene. Right now I'm just going in with the rocky terrain. As the background is actually non-interactive for the player, it can be a little bit more creative with the shapes of the buildings and organic elements. Whereas with the foreground, because the player has to kind of walk on these platforms, it has to be somewhat straight and kind of blocky. So as you can see, I am using a lot of the lasso tool and the gradient tool to very quickly just lay down some shapes that I think will suit the level. And I think this way of approach for creating Paintovers is actually very efficient, and you're not really bogged down by the details. I'm not painting every single crack on the floor, every single crack or deformation on the mountains in the background. I'm just looking at the broad shapes and just putting it down onto the canvas. At the end of the day, when the player is actually playing through this particular area of the level, the player might be just speeding through this environment. So to be honest, whether or not the player can actually see and be able to identify some of these elements, it really depends. Some players like to take their own time, but in general, it is not so important, especially at this stage, to go down to the detail level, because you're just coming up with some ideas. So adding some planets and multiple suns, kind of inspired by the Star Wars, the famous Star Wars scene where Luke comes back and his caretakers are being murdered. So just as a note, prior to actually beginning the Paintover process, I actually scoured the internet and look at inspirational images. For this particular example, I looked a lot at Spar's concept art, and I'm really inspired by his use of shapes, you know, in his building structures, in his vehicles, and even his organic elements. They tend to have this very kind of a clean silhouette to it, which I really like. Here I'm just adding in some spaceships in the midground. You can go a little bit more crazy with this Paintovers, but bear in mind that sometimes you may want to also consider not to overscope the level too much. Going for something that is ambitious may result in a delay in production and could cost your company dearly. So always kind of work with the resource budget in mind, and consider how many man hours does it take to produce assets for a level like this. I eventually did transform this level into or rather transform this Paintover into an actual playable level, and I actually dropped the spaceship idea because I was a little bit short on time, and I thought that, you know, it's not that crucial of an element. And sometimes with the background environment, less is kind of more, because at the end of the day, the focus should still be on the foreground, on the playable character. So the background shouldn't attract too much attention. It should attract enough attention to make it visually interesting, to kind of sell the mood of the level, but it doesn't have to be overpowering. Because color is so important for this level that I'm creating, I'm actually going straight with color. Sometimes when I'm doing this level Paintovers, I might start with a grayscale approach, kind of like how I did the environment design in a separate video. But for this, I just went in straight with the colors that I sort of already have in my mind. Once again, I am using a lot of gradients and using the lasso tool and alpha mask to very quickly block out the colors that I want, you know, set the lighting. And as you can see very soon, how I create the sort of the lighting effect that happens onto this mountain terrain, or this group of canyons at the back. Just using the lasso tool to block out areas where the mountain will be receiving light from the right hand side of the screen, and just, you know, using an alpha mask to just paint in the lights, and very quickly, as you can see, you kind of already have that illusion of form and light. But if you zoom in, it will not look as detailed when you zoom in. But again, that's not the point of this illustration. The good thing about doing something that is slightly more detailed is that when if let's say you are creating a 2D game, or if you are creating a 2D plane for a 3D game, it kind of hastens the process when you are actually moving on to creating the final assets for the game. Right now I'm just adding in another layer of mountains. The more layers that you have, the deeper the scene will feel. So just adding fog in between these two layers. Adding fog is a excellent method or way to push back each layer further into the background, so you kind of separate each layer a little bit more. Once again, notice that I did not zoom in when creating this Paintover. You want to look at each Paintover at such a zoom level that you can kind of see the entire level, and at the same time not get too caught up with the details. One good thing about looking at this from such a view is that you can ensure that the entire level has a coherent feel to it. Or if, for example, you want the player to experience a change of emotion as he or she progresses through the level, working at such a zoom level actually helps, because you can see the entirety of the level at one go. So just now I was adding some rim lighting from the orange or the reddish orange sun and the bluish glow from the planet behind, just to kind of highlight and, you know, accentuate the silhouette of the mountains at the background. So using the same method, I am adding in lighting for the mountains in the midground. When things are closer to the camera, you want to add a little bit more details. So I'm working with a lot of different layers. Sometimes it can be a bit confusing because when I'm trying to work fast, I don't name those layers, but it's generally a good practice, especially if you are working in teams. Usually, for Paintovers, you will not pass it around different team members, but who knows, right? So in general, it's a good practice to always name your layers, or at least, you know, put them in groups that are named, so that, you know, someone who stumbles onto this, or when you open it 2 years down the road, you kind of know what each layer is supposed to mean. And you might open it 2 years down the road, because sometimes a particular idea gets shelved, or, you know, just you might do a Paintover for this level now, but the production artist might not have time to work on this level right now, and you might revisit this maybe months down the road. So it really helps to kind of give a more coherent name to each level. For the sort of a desert environment I'm doing in the midground, I'm trying to add in a ravine to give a little bit more spice, you know, add in some visual interest. Once again, try to avoid something that catches the eye too much, but at the same time, do just enough to make the level look interesting for the player, to engage them a little bit more. And I find that playing with lighting is a great way of making a particular scene memorable. So the most kind of crucial skill set, I would say, to being an art director, or creating paintovers like this, is to kind of have a good understanding of form and lighting, and in this particular case, a good understanding of perspective, because you are kind of adding in, elements that are kind of out of this world, and the easiest way to break that sort of illusion is when you screw up on the perspective and the lighting. So if you are drawing an element, for example a spaceship or a prop or a building, that kind of feels like it doesn't belong to the scene, the first thing you should check is to see if the perspective is drawn correctly, and the second thing will be the lighting. Once these two things are kind of balanced or fixed, it should be fine. So now I'm just going in with a hard brush to add in some simple details to the building, just to denote that it's a building and not some weird shape on the desert. So because the details are a little bit more finer in the on the buildings, I resort to using brush to draw them in rather than using the lasso tool. Ideally I would have used the lasso tool as well, because it gives me a little bit more precision, and it allows me to use a more textured brush, like how I did for the rest of the painting. I'm just more used to using a square brush like this to just quickly draw out some of the details. As I mentioned, the lighting is very important, so I'm trying to kind of add in that lighting right now. As you can see, immediately with the lighting, everything looks a little bit more three-dimensional. It looks like the buildings are actually in the scene. At this stage, I think perhaps I spend too much time on the background, but I will be moving on to the foreground very soon. Just adding a little bit of final touches, some glowing lights in the background on the buildings. And some more fog and haze to really push back the background, so it really feels that all these elements are far off in the distance. Okay, with the background done, I am moving on to the foreground interactable elements, such as the ground terrain, the floating platforms. When creating the final game assets, for this particular example, it's meant for a 2D platforming game. You will want to make all these elements tolerable, meaning you can just duplicate that one small part multiple times, and then it will look like it's seamless when replicated. However, in this stage, you don't have to really be too concerned about this. You're just applying the broad strokes and kind of coming up with ideas on how the level should look like. But at the same time, when creating this Paintovers, you have to keep that in mind, that eventually these assets have to be tolerable, they have to be modular. So when it comes to designing these things, just keep that in mind. Make sure that whatever you paint in can actually be sort of created easily in the production stage. For those who are unaware, modular basically means that these assets or these objects can be mixed and matched in different combinations, kind of like a Lego brick. It's usually how we design game assets, be it 2D or 3D. We want stuff to be interchangeable so that whenever you create an object, for example a barrel, it is versatile enough to be placed in a desert environment as it is being placed in an urban environment. Personally, I do not like the idea of floating platforms because it just feels very gamey to me. So I tend to like to draw in pillars that support all the structures, so that they just not just floating around in space. Even though this scene, it is actually plausible that the platforms are floating, but personally I just don't like it. As mentioned, Paintovers are a great way to set art direction at the level to level kind of a scale. However, do note that sometimes things may happen during development that can render your Paintover obsolete. Right, this includes gameplay changes or game mechanics changes, in which case try to just breathe and adopt a flexible mindset and tweak or redo your Paintover accordingly. Trust me, it is much easier to make that change at this stage rather than during asset creation or when you are actually putting the artwork into the game engine. Just based on experience, it is seriously much harder to do so. especially when you're working on a 3D game. You don't want to spend too much time shifting things around in the 3D viewport. It's just harder. So because the size of all these elements are kind of the same, I am just duplicating them, making sure everything sort of looks right. It's funny because ultimately this image, this paintover, is not shown in the final game. So sometimes you may feel that you don't really need to spend so much time working on this, but it is critical to get it right at this stage, to minimize the back and forth process in the future when your production artists come back to you and it doesn't look quite right, and then you can point to this paintover artwork that you did in the past and say, hey, if you forgot to add this element, or hey, this element is not created properly based on my specifications. When creating this paintover, I actually forgot to include in the collectibles. I'm not sure if you can still recall, in the original grey box level there was the character sprite and the quote-unquote coins where the character is supposed to pick up. I actually forgot to paint them in. You should try to incorporate all these elements so that it feels like you're actually looking at a screenshot just from the paintover. It looks like you are looking at the actual screenshot of the final game. So right now I'm trying to add some blurred out foreground elements, making sure to make them really dark and blurred out. Once again, having more layers in your drawing will make your scene feel deeper. Just adding some lighting, and then I'm using the Gaussian blur to just blur out those elements. Adding some particle effects, smoke, really give that dusty feel to the environment. And finally, just a little bit of glow using color dodge to just give that final oomph for the level. You want to design something that excites you as a player. Like when you look at this, you feel excited. You want to play this game. You want to experience this level. That's the ultimate goal that you should be striving for. Just doing some final checks, and then I realized that I forgot to add in the final prop where the main character is supposed to be heading towards. In this case, I themed it around a spaceship, so the character is kind of like trying to escape this area. if you notice, I've actually grouped some of the similar layers into groups, and I've actually named those groups so as to avoid any sort of confusion. Just quickly blocking in the silhouette of the spaceship. Because it's kind of like a hero prop, add in a little bit more details to highlight it. I think it's still not eye-catching enough, so I'm adding in some teal glowing bits, amplifying that lighting, that glow on the spaceship. Right now I'm just doing some final adjustments before I call it done. Just making sure that, you know, the colors are right, the contrast levels are right. You know, it helps to create a saturation. So basically what I did was I create a new layer, I fill the entire layer with black, and I set the layer to the saturation blending mode to kind of check the grayscale to see if my values are right. Some final tweaks. As mentioned, eventually I did drop the whole spaceship idea because it's kind of it's too eye-catching, but for the purpose of this paintover, they kind of look good. And there you have it, the final level painted over from a screenshot of a grey box level. And I hope you learned something from today's video, and I hope to see you in the next one.